All right, welcome everybody to the short interval high severity reburns change the playing field for forest recovery webinar today. Brought to you by Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. We've got a couple of excellent speakers today, and we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. I am Corey Davis. I'm the Science Communication Specialist for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. Let me just run through a few logistics really quick. You should have any audio information in the registration email that you should have received. Also, this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting it to our Northern Rockies YouTube channel, and you can see the address there. Also, put any questions that you have for our speakers in the chat window and we will track those and get back to them. We'll save questions till the end, but we'll try and get back to all of those that you put in there. Closed captions are available. You can use the live transcript button there in your menu. And then finally, at the end, after you exit, a survey should pop up. Very short, only about 5 questions or so. And it really helps our program a lot if you can fill that out for us. So I just wanted to say a few words about the what we do at the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. We are one of 15 fire science exchanges across the country, run by the Joint Fire Science Program. And really what we do is we bring fire scientists and fire managers together to have conversations like we are today, to kind of share the latest in fire science and also for scientists to hear what the managers' needs are. So you can go to our webpage, which is listed there in firescience.org. And we have a lot of different research briefs, science reviews, videos. We have an excellent publications database as well, where you can search for the latest in fire science articles. And if you aren't in the Northern Rockies, you can look up your local fire science exchange at firescience.gov. Just look for this map here. So today we've got 2 speakers, Kristin Braziunas and Tyler Hoecker. Kristin is a postdoc at the Technical University of Munich, Germany. And Tyler is also a postdoc, and he is currently with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Center in Missoula. They did this work while in the lab of Monica Turner at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the papers that you see listed here are the ones that they're going to be mostly focusing on today. You can find these, I'll put this up again at the end, but you can also find these on our website, again, under that database. If you just type in one of their last names, the papers will come up. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristin and Tyler. All right. I'll stop sharing here.
Thanks, Corey. Can I get one thumbs up that we're looking good and sounding good?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for having us, Corey, and thanks to all the folks in the audience for being here. This is a really neat opportunity for Kristin and I to share work that we did, as Corey said, while we were lab mates in Wisconsin. And so we're trying out kind of a different format here of trying to highlight the sort of the connections and complementarity between kind of the 2 sets of work that we both did. So we're going to be talking about how these short interval high severity reburns are altering forest recovery, particularly here in the Northern Rockies. So before I go on, we want to acknowledge our co-authors and the funding and support that we've gotten from federal agencies and other organizations, and all of the folks that helped us in the field collecting this data. This, the work that we're talking about today is sort of old-fashioned field science and requires enthusiastic and hardworking teams to get it done. And we were fortunate to have those, as well as some really bright and generous co-authors. So we want to acknowledge those folks. We also want to acknowledge that this work was conducted on the homelands of many indigenous groups, and that the creation of federal public lands did rely on the forced removal of indigenous people from these lands. And that's an important truth to hold in our minds as we take a kind of Western science view of these landscapes and understanding them. And we want to recommend this book by Mark David Spence if you're interested, particularly in the national park context for that. It's no surprise to people in this audience that annual forested area burn has increased significantly over the period of the satellite record since 1984, and probably over a longer time period if we were able to look back further. And so, this landscape on the right here is a post-fire landscape, and this is the type of landscapes that we expect to become more common across the Western US and for sure in the Northern Rockies. And so we're really motivated to understand what's driving changes in fire activity and also how ecosystems are responding and what that's going to mean for ecosystem function into the future. We saw an important sort of inflection point in changes in area burned around the year 2000. That's an arbitrary year, but it distinguishes sort of two periods of fire activity in the Western US pretty well. What we see is that the dominant driver, particularly at the scale of the entire Western US, the dominant driver of this increase in area burn is really changes in fuel aridity. So as it's become warmer and drier, the conditions for burning are last longer throughout the year and are more conducive to fire. So there are some other drivers of changes in burned area that are important to acknowledge. Changes in land use, forestry, criminalization of indigenous burning, and sort of other management practices, but particularly at these large scales, climate is kind of a key driver. So that means that some of these changes in burned area, because climate is such a strong driver, that means that some of the changes in burned area that we're seeing, we can expect to continue to see unfold for at least another few decades and maybe longer. It's also important to kind of acknowledge before we dive into things that, a wildfire in a forest is not necessarily a disaster, but a wildfire in a suburban neighborhood is a disaster. And so, what makes a wildfire crisis in the Western US really is this confluence of social systems, technological systems, and ecosystems. And so this really is kind of a social ecological challenge that we face. The talk that we're going to give today is really focused on ecosystems, which form the kind of foundation that supports wildfire activity in the Western US. And that's where our expertise predominantly lies. So these other systems are super important, and they're really important for solving this challenge on the human front. We're going to focus on kind of the ecosystem kind of foundation for this challenge. It's useful to just take a moment to reflect and think, and remind ourselves why we care about ecosystem responses. So, even if we only cared about how wildfires impact people, we probably still want to know something about how ecosystems are responding to fires today, because the way that they respond today is going to shape fire activity into the future. So that's kind of a human-centric motivation for looking at ecosystems, but they also provide essential services and functions to people and non-people. And I think, a motivation for a lot of us ecologists is that, there isn't an inherent and non-material value in ecosystems that's harder to quantify, but is also important and motivates us to understand how they're changing.
All right. So for all of these reasons, it's increasingly important to ask whether forest ecosystems and the values and services that they provide are going to be resilient to, Tyler.
Sorry, Kristin, just a moment.
Whether these forests are going to be resilient to changing drivers, especially changes in climate and fire in the 21st century. And so we're going to start by giving a few definitions. So resilience is one of those words that's used in a couple different ways. Go back to the previous one for a second, Tyler. Perfect. This is an experiment, everyone. So it's very exciting. So we're going to start by defining resilience as we meet it in this context. Resilience is the ability of a forest to return to a reference structural or functional state following disturbance. And when we talk about recovery today, we're talking about the process of returning to this reference state. So for example, in a forest that is undergoing, say, differences in fire activity, we could define this reference state by things like the mature or pre-fire forest density, canopy cover, biomass, or species composition. And when we talk about kind of what a resilient forest might look like, this is depicted by this figure at the upper left, where the black line is that state. So let's say tree density. Those red bars are a fire event with the distance between the bars depicting the fire frequency and the height, maybe the burn severity. So what you see is maybe this black line, this tree density will go along, a fire happens, some trees die, but that forest has a chance to recover to its pre-fire tree density before the next fire event. So this is an example of a resilient forest. Now, forests may be adapted to a historical fire regime that's characterized by, say, infrequent long interval high severity fire or more frequent lower severity fire. But as disturbance regimes change, say, for example, fires become more frequent, as shown in the bottom center here, or burn severity increases, as shown in the bottom right, this may overwhelm the ability of a forest to recover, and it may lose its resilience, leading to a transition to maybe a state with few to no regenerating trees, something we might call a regime shift under these changing disturbance regimes. So we're going to use this framework of resilience to talk about how forests are responding to changes in fire activity today. We've talked a little bit about the end members here. So this resilience if a forest recovers to its pre-fire reference state, or regime shift if, say, the forest transitions to non-forest under altered fire activity. However, there are many different pathways of forest recovery in between those two, such as those depicted here. And these are some of the ones we're going to kind of get into a little bit in our talks today. So for example, a forest could recover after fire, but at a lower tree density, which would be an example of forest restructuring. Or we could see shifts in tree species composition, an example of reassembly, or some combination of the two, which would be replacement. Any of these nuanced changes might lead to differences in, say, the forest's ability to sequester carbon, provide wildlife habitat, nutrient cycling, or perhaps might lead to shifts in forest understory plant communities. Now, because forest recovery plays out over a long period of time, and that first wave of initial regenerating trees can help us understand successional trajectories for decades to centuries, Tyler and I focus on kind of this early period after a fire occurs to look at what potential forest recovery pathway we might be on. So we'll focus on two changing aspects of fire regime, both fire frequency and burn severity. And again, I'll start by just defining a little bit of what we mean here. We're going to be talking about short interval fire, or reburns, which we define as fire that burns the same area twice within a time period that is short relative to historical fire frequency. This is just an important thing to keep in mind, because short interval fire could mean something different in a different forest type with a different historical fire regime. Today, we're going to focus on subalpine forests that typically burned infrequently. And so when we talk about short interval fire, we're talking about two fires that occur within a 30-year period. We're also going to be talking really primarily today about high severity or stand replacing fire. By this, we mean fire that kills all or almost all of the pre-fire live vegetation, as shown in this photo in the bottom right. So, as Tyler was saying, area burned is increasing across the Western US. And as this happens, it's also increasingly likely that multiple fires will overlap. And so really simply because we're seeing increasing area burned in the Western US, we're also seeing increasing area reburned as short interval fire. So in this recent study looking at trends in the Northwest US in recent decades, Brian Harvey et al. Found that nearly a quarter of reburned areas in forests was stand replacing in both fires. And so what this means is that within this short, less than 30-year period, we have nearly a quarter areas that are in reburned areas that are burning twice and killing all of the trees in those areas. What this figure shows is this color scheme is the different historical fire regimes. So from low to mixed to high severity. And really the main takeaway point here is that reburns are widespread and happening in multiple different forest types with different historical fire regimes. So these questions are of high importance in the Northern Rockies, which is an area which has where vast amounts of forests have burned in recent years. And this northern US Rocky Mountains area is at the southern edge of the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, which is a globally significant network of protected areas. So today, Tyler and I are going to focus on two case studies within the northern US Rocky Mountains, the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and Glacier National Park. And these are ideal places to study post-fire forest recovery because in these areas, ecosystem processes can unfold in ways that are relatively less directly influenced by human intervention. So roughly half the forest in the US Northern Rockies is subalpine forest, dominated by species like lodgepole pine, western larch, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir. These are cooler, wetter forests adapted to relatively infrequent fire historically that occurred at high severity. And they're on kind of this spectrum that we see here from low elevation to high elevation, warm, dry to cool, moist. So we're going to focus really on this right end of the spectrum, these cool, wet forests. But really what we want to make sure to convey here is that there's a wide diversity in forest types present in the US Northern Rockies and throughout the Western US. And these forests are affected by interactions among climate, fire, and ecological processes. And when we talk about short interval fire, again, we want to acknowledge that might mean something different in, say, a ponderosa pine or Douglas fir woodland, which may have historically burned frequently and has low severity fire. So some of our conclusions that we're going to be talking about today are most applicable to these high elevation subalpine forests and may not directly apply to some of these warmer, drier, low elevation forest types. But as we just saw on the previous slide, all forest types are vulnerable to burning at a higher frequency of high severity fire under 21st century change. So we'll revisit some of the implications of this later in this talk. All right, so case study one, Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which is at the southern edge of the US Northern Rocky Mountains, and subalpine forests in this region are shaped by fire. As I said, they burn infrequently, so roughly every 100 to 300 years as high severity fire historically. And this leads to a patchwork as shown in the center photo here of severely burned areas, but really relatively nearby unburned forests that can serve as seed sources for tree regeneration. The forests in this region are largely dominated by serotinous lodgepole pine. And these serotinous trees, they accumulate seeds in closed serotinous cones that only open when they're heated by fire, leading to, after fire, just these vast quantities of seeds raining down and leading to forest regeneration. So this is shown in this photo on the right here, where this is an area that burned 30 years before, but you really couldn't tell if you didn't see that single lone surviving tree in the front. Otherwise, you could barely see the fire for the trees. So in addition to tree regeneration, forest fuels recover rapidly after long interval fire to which these forests are adapted. And so what we see is that canopy fuels and things like coarse wood biomass recover rapidly within 30 years to the same, to be similar to those of mature forests. Because of this, self-limiting effects of fire are relatively short-lived in these subalpine forests, really only for 10 to 20 years before a forest can burn just as severely as they did when it was a mature forest. So I looked at this in the 2016 Berry Fire, which happened in Grand Teton National Park. It was the largest fire in Grand Teton National Park history. And it both burned older forests as long interval fire, which is shown kind of in this brown box plot here, and it burned young forests as short interval fires shown in the green box plot. And these box plots are showing the burn severity in these different forests, the young forest and the older forest. And what we found is that burn severity in the berry fire did not differ between these areas that burned as short versus long interval fire. We also found that on days of high fire spread, both young and mature forest, roughly half of that area burned as stand replacing fire, which is shown by this dashed black line on the figure here. However, even in fire adapted forests, like those present throughout Yellowstone, these forests may still be vulnerable if they burn as short interval fire. And this is because these young trees, less than 30-year-old trees, have not had a chance to accumulate their serotinous seed bank that would jumpstart the process of forest recovery. And so I'll focus really on mostly on serotiny here in this case study, but Tyler will get into some other tree species traits related to fire adaptation in his talk. So we collected field data in Greater Yellowstone in summer 2021 to ask two research questions. First, how do short interval fire and a variety of other factors, including climate, topography, and distance to unburned live forest edge, interact to affect post-fire tree regeneration? And second, how do forest biomass and fuels vary following short versus long interval severe fire? And the second question is kind of particularly important as we think back to this rapid recovery of fuels after long interval fire. Could we see something different after short interval fire if tree regeneration is lowered? Could we start to see potentially a more strong limitation on subsequent burn severity or spread following reburns? So I answered these questions by collecting data in recent reburns where fires had burned the same area twice as stand replacing fire within that less than 30-year period. These were reburns that occurred between 1994 and 2018 and had been 3 to 27 years since they'd happened at the time that I sampled the data. They were in subalpine forests previously dominated by lodgepole pine. And I used burn severity data to first identify a short interval plot location. This was an area that had burned twice as stand replacing fire. And so that's shown, these areas are shown in this dark tan here, and our short interval plot, for example, was this pink circle. And then once we had our short interval location, we identified a nearby area that also burned in the same most recent fire as long interval fire, also stand replacing, shown in this dark brown shade here and this green triangle. And these two plots were otherwise very similar. They shared similar topographic characteristics like elevation, slope, and aspect. And so what this did was give us this paired plot data set that allowed us to make really robust conclusions about the role specifically of short interval fire. We were also able to leverage previously collected data collected after the 1988 fires and paired short and long interval fire plots by Tanya Schoenagel. I had an exceptional field team working with me, shown here, and we sampled forest recovery, which we quantified with tree regeneration, as well as live and dead forest biomass and fuels. So what did we find? Starting with tree regeneration, we found that tree regeneration density was nearly an order of magnitude lower in short compared to long interval fire. So this photo, is a really nice example of that. It's an overhead photo that was taken where the 2006 Derby fire reburned the 1990 Iron Mountain fire on the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. And you can really just see this stark line in between short interval fire on the left and long interval fire on the right. We also found that tree densities were lower in short interval plots that were farther away from live unburned forest edge. And that makes intuitive sense, but what's interesting is we did not find that relationship in long interval fire. So there was an interaction between short interval fire and distance to live forest. And so what this really translates into is, remember those long interval plots, they have their serotinous seed bank But we're finding that after short interval fire, these forests can no longer rely on the serotinous seed bank for recovery. They're much more reliant on seed sources, on surviving live seed sources for forest recovery. As an interesting contrast to conifers, which were lower in reburns, aspen densities were over 6 times higher after short interval fire. And this relates to another fire adaptive trait, which is something that aspen can do, which is resprout from below ground roots after fire. And so what was happening in these short interval plots is that after the first fire had happened less than 30 years before, aspen were able to come in and regenerate from seed. And then when the second fire came through and killed everything above ground, the aspen had a leg up and they were able to resprout and regrow rapidly from their below ground roots. Now, what about fuels? So these are some photos from our paired plots showing long interval on the top and short interval on the bottom. And what we found is that short interval plots had half as much dead woody biomass and 7 times less live woody biomass compared to long interval plots. We also found that large standing dead snags were virtually absent from short interval plots. And so these are those important 1,000-hour fuels once they fall and become coarse wood on the ground. And really in these short interval areas, it's just the trees within 30 years did not have a chance to grow as large before they burned again. Instead, reburns had a higher proportion of kind of small to medium-sized woody fuels. So these 10 or 100-hour fuels, as shown kind of on the upper left here, these kind of standing little toothpick trees, and the bottom here after they've all fallen down and it's much more manageable to walk through. So we had a higher proportion of these small to medium-sized fuels, and we also found that both short and long interval plots had similar amounts of some of the fine surface fuels, things like shrubs, litter, and duff. So bringing this together, overall, short interval fire disrupts the process of biomass recovery after fire. So going back to kind of the beginning of this case study, we talked about the rapid recovery of fuels after long interval fire. That's shown here in our plots on the left here. So what we've got is time is on the x-axis and the biomass is on the y-axis. And we have right after fire, there's kind of downed wood. It's shown in dark brown here. There's a downed wood on the ground. There are also these large standing snags. Over time, the snags fall and become part of the dead wood pool. And we also have shown in green this live biomass, this rapid recovery of live biomass as the trees regenerate rapidly and regrow rapidly and put on a lot of foliage. Contrast this rapid recovery following long interval fire with short interval plots, which are shown on the right here. We really saw almost no change in biomass over the first 30 years after fire. Very little additional snag pool, and kind of those live biomass pools remained very, very low and changed little, did not accumulate rapidly over time. And so that live biomass, really, it's not building that canopy fuel bank that might support the next severe fire within a short period of time. So really what we're seeing is that potentially, after short interval fire, there's a much prolonged period of fuel limitation on subsequent burn severity that could last for over 30 years.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristin. So what you're going to hear now is some examples of reburns in subalpine forests from Glacier National Park in Northwest Montana. And so you're going to notice that there's a lot of consistency in what we find, but there's also some interesting differences in Glacier. And part of that has to do with differences in tree diversity in Glacier relative to the greater Yellowstone. The Yellowstone Plateau in particular is somewhat unusual in that it's dominated largely by lodgepole pine. Glacier sits at this interesting biogeographic kind of intersection of different biogeographies and that creates high tree diversity, relatively high tree diversity for temperate forests. So one of the ways to organize our thinking about tree diversity and what it might mean in terms of fire and how ecosystems respond to fire is to think about fire relevant traits. Sometimes we talk about fire adaptations or fire dependent traits, and I'm going to generalize that a little bit more to just say that these are all traits that are fire relevant. And there's a lot of ways to kind of slice and dice this type of system, but we can group sets of similar traits into what we might call syndromes. And those syndromes describe a strategy for dealing with an environment that's fire prone. So we have fire avoiders that grow in places that don't often burn. So those might be, persistent fire refugia. We have, and so our western red cedars or western hemlock would fit into that. Subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce to a certain extent either occupy places that don't burn ever, or they occupy places that have not burned for a long time. So, and then we have fire resistors. These are species that have traits like thick bark, self-pruning, and they can survive and they can coexist in systems that burn frequently, and they can resist fire and survive as individual trees. We also have fire embracers, which tolerate fire in a different way, not by surviving as individuals, but surviving, kind of passing on their genes through serotinous cones or other types of strategies that allow one cohort to be totally consumed by and killed by a fire, and the next cohort to reestablish and kind of continue those genes on the landscape. So I'm going to kind of talk about these types of traits as I talk about what we saw in terms of changes in composition in Glacier. Folks in this audience might be familiar with the Howe Ridge fire that burned in 2018. This was in the news because it burned right across the lake from the Lake McDonald Lodge. It threatened and burned some private inholdings in Glacier National Park, and it also threatened Lake McDonald Lodge. This was an interesting fire to study because it burned almost entirely within the footprint of the 2003 Robert fire, which was a much larger but largely high severity fire in Glacier. What we were able to take advantage of here were two fires that occurred on either side of Lake McDonald. The Sprague fire in 2017, you might have heard on the news because it partially destroyed the Sperry Chalet, which has since been rebuilt. And on the other side of the lake was this Howe Ridge fire. So this gave us this natural experiment to compare what does forest recovery look like in a setting that we think of as more historically typical, this long interval mature forest burning in the Sprague fire, versus this setting or context that we think may become more common in the future as the area burned increases, this young, in this case, just 15-year-old forest burning in a high severity fire, or reburning in a short interval high severity fire. So as just a little bit of additional context on these two fires, I want to also point out that that historically the composition of these forests was there was a lot of cedar hemlock in these areas around Lake McDonald. That's familiar to folks that have driven along the lake, but that cedar hemlock forest historically extended all the way around the lake. And it also was historically characterized by a lot of spruce and fir. So these are vegetation data from surveys that Glacier National Park did, and they reflect forest composition before sort of in the 90s. So before either of these fires and before that 2003 Robert fire. So you can see there's some patches of lodgepole pine and larch that probably reflect historical burns here. But I wanted you to just keep in mind that if we're thinking about resilience and returning to kind of a pre-disturbance mature state, this is really the composition that characterized this area historically. This is a finding that's really consistent with what Kristin just described. We found that this relationship between pre and post-fire structure really starts to break down in these short interval reburns. So for a bunch of reasons, we might have an expectation that areas that supported high tree density before a disturbance should have that capacity to support a high post-fire tree density after the disturbance. And we see that that is the case when we look at mature forests. That can be due to things like serotiny, can be due to things like residual structure providing microclimatic buffering. It can be due to things like site index and site condition and places that support more or less productivity. That kind of relationship breaks down in the short interval fires, and sort of regardless of your pre-fire tree density in a short interval reburn, you're sort of constrained to a lower, these areas are constrained to a lower tree density. I just want to note that, 1,000 trees per hectare is still a lot. So in this case, we're not talking about a regime shift to non-forest, but we are talking about a significant and marked change in forest structure. Switching to composition here, I'm going to return to this map of pre-fire vegetation. So in the case of this long interval fire, this historical composition here matches what we surveyed in the plots that we established, these gray dots. The proportion of different species here on this map is very similar to what we sampled. So we had a representative sample of this composition that reflected that pre-fire composition in this area. And it's what we expect for these sort of cool, wet subalpine forests. And when this area burns, we see sort of changes in composition that are consistent with what we would expect. That fire favors fire adapted species, or species with traits that allow them to persist after fire. And that makes sense. That's consistent with what we know about fire activity in these forests. The kind of traditional successional model would suggest that over time, we might expect this composition to sort of gradually transition back towards this mature forest state as spruce and fir and shade tolerant species have the opportunity to make their way back into this landscape. But the question then is, what happens if we see another high severity fire before these kind of successional dynamics have had a chance to play out? So I just want to note, so it's not confusing, that we're moving to a different place now, and the pre-fire composition here no longer matches this map because it had already burned once, and it doesn't exactly match the post-fire composition of the long interval fire because it's a slightly different area, but you can see that the patterns are similar. So this young forest that established after the first fire was dominated by fire adapted species, larch, lodgepole pine, a little bit of spruce and fir was able to recolonize this site after just 15 years. When this reburned, we see that these fire adapted traits and these pathways of composition that favor fire adapted traits are really strongly reinforced by a second burn. And so we are really losing these less fire adapted species. And what's really important here, thinking about the long-term trajectory, is that as this reburns, we're really losing that material, the seed sources, the residual structure that would be needed to facilitate kind of a trajectory back towards that historical composition. And so, I asked this rhetorical question of, do we think it's possible that this area is going to return to a cedar, hemlock, and spruce fir forest? I think the answer is no, but we sort of have to wait and see what happens over this long time period. But we do know that the short interval reburns really do reinforce these fire adapted species. So the kind of the detail oriented among us are going to be asking, like, that's cool, but what are the mechanisms that are really driving these changes in composition? And so we did a little bit of modeling to get at that I won't go into detail on the methodology, but what I'm going to show here is a breakdown between these fire sensitive, relatively mesic, relatively shade tolerant species versus the more fire adapted, relatively xeric, relatively shade intolerant species. And what we're seeing here is the effect of different predictor variables on the density of a given species seedlings post-fire. And so positive values mean that has a positive effect on post-fire tree density of that species, and negative values means it has a negative impact on seedling density of that species. In a nutshell, what we see is that for sort of more mesic or shade tolerant species, we do see some effect of kind of microclimate or aspect, or this abiotic effective aspect. So if you're located on a northerly aspect that tends to be buffered from high temperatures, that's a benefit if you're a mesic species. And we see a strong effect of pre-fire basal area, which is sort of a proxy for residual structure that buffers the post-fire microclimate, or perhaps some residual seed sources that survive the fire. And we also see this negative effect of long distances to the unburned edge where seed sources will be available. It's a different story when we look at these kind of more relatively xeric, more shade intolerant species. In this case, in this Glacier National Park context, which is a relatively cool and wet forest still today, we see that these biotic effects of seed source are really the dominant drivers. So, it's important to acknowledge that this study took place over a short period of time. This represents just a couple growing seasons, and so it's probably not long enough to capture interannual climate variability that could have some effect even in Glacier. But we see that compared to these more mesic species, these biotic effects are particularly strong. So I don't want to give the impression that abiotic kind of factors and microclimate are not important. They are. And, there's kind of a lot of well-established empirical and theoretical work on this, that juvenile individuals tolerate a much narrower range of environmental conditions than do adults. And we did an experiment to get at this down in Yellowstone, where we put soil moisture and soil temperature sensors in different landscape positions and planted seeds and looked at rates of germination, survival, and establishment. And we found that the soils were about 2 degrees warmer and 25% drier in short interval reburns than in long interval fires. So there's kind of two interacting effects here that I want to point out. So the solid lines here are the short interval fires, and you'll see that across aspects, short interval fires tend to be warmer and drier than long interval fires, so about 25% drier. And you can see these differences in aspect where south-facing slopes tend to be warmer and drier than north-facing slopes. So I've highlighted this gray area, which is sort of a danger zone for lethal conditions for seedlings. And you can see that if you're on a south-facing slope in a short interval reburn, you're spending an awful lot of the summer in that danger zone. And so we found that does have a clear negative impact on seedling establishment in the first few years after fire.
All right, so thanks, Tyler. Let's bring it all together and revisit our resilience framework and what we've learned about how short interval fire might alter forest recovery pathways. So successful forest recovery is enabled by ecological legacies, many of which we've discussed in our case studies. For example, live trees might survive a fire, either within a burned area or outside of a burned patch, and provide those all-important seed sources. Trees might have fire adaptive traits such as serotiny or thick bark, long distance dispersal, drought tolerance, or resprouting. And remaining large standing dead snags might provide shade and buffer some microclimate conditions experienced by seedlings coming back after fire. So under historical fire regimes, these legacies tend to be sufficiently present to enable resilient forest recovery. However, under altered fire regimes, such as high-severity reburns, many of these legacies are lost. Material legacies like serotinous seed banks are gone. Live seed sources may be farther away, or they may be these kind of shorter forests that are still young forests that recently burned themselves. And microclimate buffering may be reduced or eliminated. And together, this may shift the relative advantage of some of those species traits that we've talked about. So in our case studies, we found evidence of the impact of these reduced post-fire legacies on forest recovery. And so first I'm going to talk about the evidence we found for some of this forest restructuring recovery pathway. So first of all, as Tyler nicely pointed out, and was the case in my plots too, we still had a lot of tree regeneration following short interval fire at densities that were on average what we'd call self-replacement density. So at or above kind of the density that we might expect in a mature forest. So this suggests that eventually these forests may be able to fully recover to their pre-fire state. However, what we really found was very strong evidence for delayed forest recovery. So this is shown here in this conceptual figure by the difference between this kind of light peach line, or line A, which is after a long interval fire. You see that kind of above ground biomass is here on the y-axis, time is on the x. And so after long interval fire, you start maybe a little less than half of your pre-fire above ground biomass. And we see this rapid recovery of biomass back to that pre-fire state. However, after short interval fire, first of all, you start at a much lower position because some of that biomass has already been consumed by the second fire. And then we have lower tree regeneration. So it takes longer for the forest to make that full recovery pathway shown in this line B here. If we have additional factors, such as a long distance to unburned live forest edge, this could delay forest recovery even further, such as in line C, but maybe it'll still make a full recovery. But then if we have additionally, say, warmer and drier microclimate conditions and general warming climate trends, potentially we're going to see a scenario where that forest is no longer able to recover to its pre-fire conditions and only recovers kind of halfway there, as shown in this dotted D line. Now, if at any point in this process that forest burns again, this could be an area that's vulnerable to surprising change and maybe even that regime shift pathway. In addition, there's the implications of these reduced post-fire fuels and slower biomass recovery for potential self-limiting effects of short interval reburns. So what our findings suggested was that burn severity may be limited for a much longer period of time following short compared to long interval fire. So specifically, these short interval areas had lower canopy fuel loads, which could reduce the likelihood of crown fire, and also lower coarse woody debris biomass, which could reduce the amount of time that a fire can stay and continue to burn in a given area. And these changes could be a very important negative feedback on future fire behavior that could potentially even enable the forest to persist by mitigating the likelihood of future forest loss. In contrast, though, we still found abundant fine surface fuels following reburns, suggesting that self-limitation might not extend to fire spread. So especially if kind of in these sparser areas, we see recovery of other fuels like grasses or herbs, we may still see the fire able to spread just as effectively following a short interval reburn. So another way to say this is that self-limitation effects may be particularly important for determining the ecological effects of fire in a reburned area, but they appear unlikely to limit expected regional increases in area burned anytime in the near future.
So what does this mean for reassembly? So I'm going to kind of return to this fire trait syndrome kind of idea. And really, we see that there's some kind of clear winners and losers that we can imagine sort of moving forward as reburns become more common and some of these kind of post-fire climatic constraints are amplified, as Kristin mentioned. So we saw lots of aspen. I didn't show those results for Glacier, but we saw a similar pattern of increases in the density of aspen and even willow in our reburned plots. We saw really, we saw that those fires really favored larch. Larch is an interesting species in that it can both embrace fire, it has thick bark, and it can survive fire. It also is a prolific cedar. And so just one surviving individual larch tree can reseed an area much in the same way that a serotinous lodgepole pine might. Does require sort of unburned surviving cones to do that, but the end result can be similar. Lodgepole pine has a clear fire adaptation in serotiny, which could be undermined if fire return intervals become really short, but in many cases is favored by the type of fire activity we're seeing more of. Species like Douglas fir that have thick bark, or we didn't talk much about here today, but species like ponderosa pine that today occur at lower elevations, but may find themselves in more suitable climatic and disturbance regimes at higher elevations moving forward. So what this can help us do, there's sort of formal ways of playing out these trajectories with simulation or statistical modeling. But for today, we're just going to kind of think qualitatively about what that might mean for the future. So returning to this framework, in this case, we saw examples of restructuring and reassembly, and we saw maybe some hints that regime shifts are likely in like the most vulnerable positions, for example, south-facing slopes and reburns, or at the lowest elevation parts of our subalpine forests. And we might expect the chance of regime shifts. We expect that the opportunity for regime shifts is going to increase moving forward. So we need sort of additional frameworks to help us think about, okay, when we do undergo a regime shift, or we're facing likely regime shifts, what do we do with that information? So where are these kind of post-resilience landscapes headed, and are we okay with that? So a framework that's been developed by folks in the National Park Service and other agencies and with other scientists is this resist, accept, direct, or RAD framework. So besides having a cool acronym, it's a helpful way to kind of partition our thinking around how we make decisions based on information about vegetation trajectories. So resist is this idea of, we're really not okay with the potential trajectory, and so we want to really dig our heels in and do the best we can to resist those types of transformations or regime shifts. Accept might be cases where, we are okay giving up some woodland in favor of grassland and rangeland in some cases, maybe, or other examples of shifts in composition or that we might be okay with. And then we can think about things that we might want to direct, which falls somewhere in between here, where we may not be particularly happy with the trajectory if we take a hands-off approach, but maybe there are opportunities to direct the trajectory of ecosystem recovery in ways that we find more desirable. So just to put a little bit finer point and provide some really general examples of what this might look like, we've spent today, I'll start on the right here because we spent today focusing on these subalpine forests. So resisting these types of trajectories in subalpine forests might look like fire suppression, actually. It might look like replanting the same species that burned on the post-fire landscape. And those strategies may or may not be effective. Accepting might look like, just allowing a transition to a different forest type. Maybe we're just fine with a transition from a spruce fir forest to a larch lodgepole pine forest, or a transition from forest to shrubland. Maybe we're okay with that. We might also do things like replant. If we're not okay with those trajectories, we might try to direct them by, for example, replanting with fire resistant and drought tolerant or more future proof species than the historical composition, and doing that in an intentional way. We might make more intentional and judicious use of wildland fire and prescribed fire. We might allow high severity fires to burn so that they create kind of landscape scale heterogeneity and sort of punch holes in the continuity of fuels at the landscape scale. On the other end of the spectrum, these strategies look different. So resisting might involve more protecting individual trees that are particularly fire resistant. It might mean mechanical thinning to reduce burn severity, or prescribed burning to reduce wildfire severity. Accepting might look different because it's, instead of accepting a transition in composition, it might be accepting a transition to a wholly different ecosystem type, and that may or may not be acceptable. And then directing again might look like favoring fire resistant species, being more active about our prescribed burning, or being really hands-on with the way that we manage fuels. For example, using this kind of eco individuals, clumps, and openings model. So these are just general examples, and the bigger point here is that if we're facing regime shift, we might want to start thinking more seriously about what it means to adapt, and what that means is going to look very different in different forest types. So with that, we'll take questions.
All right, thanks, Kristin and Tyler. You guys did a great job. At the moment, I don't see any questions, but folks, please put your questions in the chat box for Tyler and Kristin. Are you guys looking at the chat box as well? They come through, Kristin? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? You guys were too thorough. We covered everything. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Well, there we go. One of you want to take this question from Casey? How much does topography affect regen?
Sure, I can start by answering that because I did an experiment that looked at the impact of topography in the greater Yellowstone. I went sort of quickly through the setup of that experiment, but we planted seeds on different aspects. So I'm not sure if you, by topography, you mean elevation or aspect, but in the case of aspect has a big effect on regeneration. And so I sort of mentioned that south-facing slopes, tend to be warmer and drier. And so those are the places where today we're starting to already experience kind of conditions that are lethal for seedlings. And those are the places that in the future, we expect those types of conditions to become more and more common or the norm. So yes, topography has a huge impact. And those ideas are analogous when we think about elevation, where lower elevations tend to be warmer and drier. And so we see stronger kind of climatic constraints at those lower elevations than we do at the higher elevations. Kristin, do you have anything to add from your study?
No, I mean, I think you pretty much got it. In my case, I was controlling for differences in topography, so not we did look for effects of topography and didn't really find a lot of significant differences we found that kind of the short interval fire effect was the dominant one that we picked up in our data set.
Do you want to take this next one?
Yeah, I can start. I think you can also chime in here. So the next question is, can you talk a little bit about the significance of using 30 years for reburn effects in subalpine forests? And so I'm not quite sure. I mean, there are two ways I see this question. One is using 30 years between the fires as the definition of short interval fire. And the other might be when we actually measure our forests. So in this case, everything that like what Tyler measured was in the first couple of years, and what I measured was within the first 30 years. So I guess I'll just, in case the question is about that, I'll answer that first. We have 30 years between fires. Okay, good. Okay, so I mean, I think there are a few different angles to look at that. One is kind of just going back to that original definition of resilience and recovery. We were looking at essentially a time window that we knew was going to be short relative to the length of time it takes a forest to recover to its pre-fire conditions. which would be, that could be we know that recovery is rapid in these forests. That could be in the realm of like 80 to 100 years. And so 30 years is much shorter than that. Kind of another lens through which thinking about that 30 years as a special number there is, there was a study done about 10 years ago by Leroy Westerling looking at Greater Yellowstone and projecting kind of future fire activity in the region. And just based on the climate projections, there was this expectation that fire return intervals could go from this historically long return interval period to shortening to less than 30 years between fires by the end of the 21st century. And so, maybe 20 years ago, we might have thought, okay, burning with 100 years, less than 100 years between the two fires might be a short interval fire in these forest types. But we're now seeing more and more cases of even much shorter intervals, this less than 30-year period. And so we really wanted to hone in on this trend that's increasing to happen, what might happen in these areas that are burning so frequently. So those are kind of a couple lenses through which the 30 years comes from. Tyler, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah. The only kind of complementary piece I'll add is that, the time that it takes different species to reach sexual maturity has a big influence on, what number makes the most sense in a given system. So, 30 years is it's not arbitrary, but it's not a fixed number, right? It's sort of a general time frame that makes sense for these forests that we talked about today. Like Michelle Agni has a cool paper looking at serotinous knobcone pine in California, and those reach sexual maturity after 5 years. And so reburns that happen shorter than 5 years make a big difference in that system, but 30 years is plenty of time for them to recover serotinous cones. That's not the case for lodgepole pine. Lodgepole pine take, more like 25 to 30 years to start to have, a significant number of serotinous cones. So I think that's the other important consideration to keep in mind. That's really an important one for serotiny, but is also relevant for other species like larch, where, they may not have developed the thick bark or starting to, develop the height to resist fire. So I think the 30 years is kind of a rule of thumb for this system, but, it sort of depends on your species and the context if you are wanting to apply that to a different system.
Okay, so just another question. The total biomass was lower. Was the decrease in forbs and shrubs noticeably lower as well? An excellent question. So I just looked at shrubs in my case and found that there was not a significant difference, at least in shrub biomass, between short and long interval plots. But really what I want to do here is plug an upcoming study by soon to be published study by one of my co-authors and kind of my co-field lead, Nathan Keel, who specifically looked at the understory plant community following short compared to long interval fires and looked at kind of changes in these plant communities. So I'll just plug that. I don't have kind of the numbers on the top of my head, but Nathan, you could always say something in the chat if you feel like chiming in there.
While we wait for Nathan to chime in if he wants to, I actually threw in a bonus slide on this question in Glacier, and this is not biomass, so that's important to say. This is percent cover based on quadrats. But what this shows is that shrub cover was significantly higher after short interval fires than after long interval fires, whereas forb cover was significantly higher after long interval fires than short interval fires. So we didn't dig super deeply into the mechanisms here. I think it has to do with that microclimatic buffering provided by residual structure, that kind of the cooler and slightly wetter conditions that we see in the long interval fires are more better support kind of the forbs and wildflowers that we might be familiar with on post-fire landscapes, and these kind of drier settings that we see after short interval fires. The shrubs tend to do better, and that probably has to do with their being able to regenerate from surviving root structures as well. So that doesn't necessarily get at biomass, but that's what we found in terms of percent cover in Glacier.
I wanted to make sure you guys saw this question from Colleen about are any of your results being used in silviculture decisions, for example, post-harvest stocking?
Thanks, Corey. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that I've been kind of working more towards as a postdoc, is kind of this work and more recent work that I've been doing, trying to provide information that can be used in that sort of a context. I can't give you any specific examples of silviculturists that are using this information. I hope that there are silviculturists in the audience and that are checking out the research briefs and tuning in and hearing about this stuff. And I guess I'll say my opinion is that I hope that silviculturists are using this information. I think that if we are replanting with exact same species, that may work now, but I think that we are sort of running on that the window in which replanting with the historical composition is viable is getting smaller and smaller. So there's a lot of replanting and reforestation is a complex challenge, having to do with all kinds of factors, including getting seedlings and nurseries and all of that. So obviously there's a lot more to it, but I hope that we can start to use this sort of information as we design our replanting strategies. Do you want to add anything, Kristin?
No, I think you got it. So there's a question from my dad. Are there any studies on plots that have undergone second reburns? I think this is a fascinating question, and kind of as we set it up, we have this expectation of this kind of ratchet down potentially after successive reburn events. And I mean, there is one study that I know of that comes to mind that was done in Alaska by Kate Hayes, where she looked at kind of single burns, reburns, and triple burns, and basically found support for this idea, at least in those ecosystems, that these effects of repeat short interval fires, and in this case, triple burns, continue to accumulate. So found evidence for kind of that expectation that we'd see continual declines in kind of the starting point of forest recovery. Anything else that comes to mind for you, Tyler?
Just that sort of phenomenon is starting to become more common, like in the Southwest, where conditions are really hot and dry and fire conducive, and so those examples are sort of limited still in the Northern Rockies. But otherwise, yeah, agree with what you said, Kristin.
So there's another question here about measuring 1,000-hour fuels and difference in fuel loads. And so, yes, I measured, in my paired plots, I measured kind of 1 hour, 10-hour, 100-hour, and 1,000-hour. But kind of there's an important distinction here, is that I had this range of time-sense fire periods between 3 and 27 years. And so when I examined each individual fuel pool, it was some of them were snags and some of them were downed. And so I didn't find differences between kind of these fuel pools, but that's really largely because in some fires, the 1,000-hour fuels were still standing. They were still the standing dead snags. And so if those had fallen down, and I looked at, kind of large woody fuels in general, you would have seen a significant difference. But really what we found was basically like the test we did was total dead woody biomass, which did very much significantly differed, by a factor of 2 between short and long interval plots. And yeah, if we, so some of those finer distinctions between the 1,000-hour fuels were lost because some of them were on the ground and some of them were still standing just because there was variable time since fire in our plots.
All right. Does anybody else have any further questions for Tyler or Kristin? Okay. Well, yeah, thanks again, you guys. And thanks everybody for participating today. Again, you can find Kristin and Tyler's articles on our database. And let me see, I can pull up those papers again. You guys seeing that? All right. Well, yeah, if nobody else has any further questions, we'll end it here. Again, this has been recorded. And so the recording will be put up on our YouTube page here in probably within the next week or so. So you can point other people to it as well and use it in trainings or whatever else you may use it for. And yeah, I guess that's about it. Thanks everybody again for participating, and thank you, Kristin and Tyler, for the great work.